topic, What Happens to Kidnappers in Jail, explores the fate of individuals convicted of kidnapping crimes and the consequences they face while incarcerated. In many cases, inmates convicted of heinous crimes like child abduction and homicide face harsh treatment and disdain from both prison staff and fellow prisoners. The notoriety of their crimes often makes them targets for aggression and retaliation from other inmates who may seek to enact their own form of justice. And today's video is all about the various legal proceedings, sentencing outcomes, and the impact of imprisonment on these offenders. 1. John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy was an American serial criminal who gained infamy for committing heinous crimes in the 1970s. He is responsible for the physical assault and homicide of at least 33 teenage boys and young men. How did he do this? Well, Gacy lured his victims to his home under false pretenses, officially kidnapping them and then subjecting them to unspeakable acts before putting their lives to an end. Fun fact about him, due to his involvement in charitable events and parties where he dressed up as a clown, he became known as the Killer Clown. In 1980, Gacy was convicted of his crimes and sentenced to death. However, the lengthy appeals process kept him on death row for several years. During his time in jail, Gacy was confined to a maximum security facility, Menard Correctional Center in Illinois, after receiving sentencing. Because of the notoriety of his crimes, he spent most of his time in isolation to protect himself from potential violence by other inmates seeking retribution. The treatment of kidnappers like Gacy in jail can vary depending on the circumstances and the type of prison they are in. In high-security facilities, notorious criminals are often placed in protective custody or solitary confinement to ensure their safety and that of others. Gacy's crimes had made him a target for violence, and authorities took strict measures to prevent any harm from befalling him while in custody. While serving his time in jail, Gacy was reputable for being a model inmate. He maintained that he was innocent by rising to the position of head cook in his first few months of arrival. He also secured an increase in the daily pay of the inmates in the prison's mess hall and supervised many projects to improve the condition of his inmates. One of these projects included installing a miniature golf course. And around February 1970, his efforts were recognized by the Inmate JC chapter. But despite his insistence on his innocence, his crimes were well documented and heavily publicized, making him one of the most infamous criminals to have ever existed in the history of America. But what became of John Wayne Gacy in the end? Shortly after midnight of May 10, 1994, John Wayne Gacy's time on death row came to an end when he was executed by lethal injection. On May 9th, he was allowed to have a private picnic on jail grounds with his family. He ordered his last meal and left this world as a punishment for the heinous crimes he had committed. His execution gathered over 1,000 people, the majority of whom were in favor of the execution, and a select few who were anti-death penalty protesters. But most importantly, it brought closure to many of the victims' families and marked the end of a long and painful chapter in American criminal history. 2. Robert Black. Born on April 21, 1947, Robert Black was a notorious Scottish serial offender and child kidnapper who committed heinous crimes during the 1980s and 1990s. He was responsible for the abduction, physical assault, and elimination of several young girls in the United Kingdom and Ireland. Black was a predatory offender who targeted vulnerable children, often abducting them while they were walking to or from school. He had a grim history of physically assaulting and extinguishing young girls, and his crimes left a trail that was not easy for the detectives to put together. In 1990, Black was finally apprehended in Scotland and charged with the abduction and homicide of 3 young girls. Following this, he was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment for these crimes. Over time, additional evidence linked him to other unsolved child abduction cases, and he was eventually convicted of 4 more cases in England and Ireland. Kidnappers like Robert Black in jail experience a high level of security and isolation from the general prison population. To protect them from harm, notorious criminals like Black may be placed in protective custody or solitary confinement. In these settings, they are separated from other prisoners, have limited interactions with fellow inmates, and are closely monitored by prison authorities. This isolation is intended not only to ensure the safety of the inmate, but also to prevent any attempt at escape or further harm to others. But there were no records of Black being isolated from the others, and given the nature of his crime and the potential risk he could pose to other inmates, Black faced a lot of threats. One of these instances includes July 1995, when Black was attacked at Wakefield Prison by 2 inmates, leaving him with superficial wounds, burns, and bruises. The things they did were unspeakable, but nowhere close to what Black may have deserved for the crimes he committed. The 2 inmates were, however, given an extra 3 years jail term. Later, Black openly talked about his childhood and teenage experiences, including the physical abuse he endured at the Red House care home. While in jail, Robert Black maintained his innocence, but the overwhelming evidence against him resulted in multiple multiple convictions. The Scottish criminal drew a comparison between himself and an actor taking on a role in a play while committing his dreadful deeds. He shared this assertion during a series of interviews with a prominent forensic psychiatrist. Black spent his remaining years behind bars, and in 2016 he passed away in prison, ending his reign of terror. Black passed away from a heart attack while he was at HMP Magaberry on January 12, 2016, when he was 68 years old. On January 29th, a cremation ceremony took place at Roselawn Crematorium, located outside Belfast. However, no family or friends attended this service. The Presbyterian chaplain of HMP Magaberry, Reverend Rodney Cameron, conducted a brief service during which he read a section of Psalm 90. In February 2016, Black's ashes were scattered at sea. 3. Ariel Castro. Ariel Castro was a Cleveland, Ohio man who gained international infamy in 2013 when he was arrested for the horrifying abduction, imprisonment, and repeated physical assault of 3 young women, Michelle Knight, Amanda Berry, and Gina DeJesus. He held them captive periodically, chaining them in various rooms, including the basement, and controlling their access to food and toilets. The rescue of these women occurred on May 6, 2013, when one of them managed to break part of a door and call for help, leading to their liberation. Following his arrest, Castro faced a multitude of charges, including kidnapping, rape, and aggravated homicide for inducing miscarriages by beating one of the captives. In July 2013, he pleaded guilty to 937 counts of various crimes to avoid the death penalty. He was subsequently sentenced to life in prison plus 1,000 years without the possibility of parole. Once in jail, kidnappers like Ariel Castro often face a highly secure and restricted environment. Given the nature of their crimes, they are frequently perceived as dangerous and may be targeted by other inmates seeking to harm them. As a result, they are typically placed in protective custody or kept in isolation to prevent any potential acts of violence. In Castro's case, he was held in isolation from the general prison population to ensure his safety and to avoid any further complications within the prison system. This isolation can be mentally and emotionally taxing, as inmates have limited social interaction and are subjected to constant monitoring by prison authorities. Ariel Castro was despised by many, and his case garnered significant media attention. However, in September 2013, just a few weeks into his life sentence, Castro was found dead in his prison cell. He had committed suicide by hanging, bringing an abrupt end to his life and evading the harsh realities of serving his sentence. Ariel Castro, the Cleveland kidnapper, took his own life after becoming increasingly frustrated with the conditions in his cell, obsessed with the prison food quality, and convinced that he was being mistreated by the guards. 2 consultants, recognized as national experts on prison conditions, released their findings, dismissing the state prisons agency's previous suggestion that Castro's death might have been accidental and related to seeking a physical thrill. The consultants' report stated that the 53-year-old inmate's death was unlikely to be the result of autoerotic asphyxiation, a practice where individuals choke themselves to unconsciousness for physical gratification. Instead, it pointed to his growing realization of spending the rest of his life in prison as the probable motive behind his suicide. While Castro's suicide closed the chapter on his case, it did not bring closure to the victims and their families, who were left to grapple with the trauma and long-term effects of their captivity. The pain and suffering endured by Michelle Knight, Amanda Berry, and Gina DeJesus were immeasurable, and their courageous escape served as a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit. 4. Richard Haupman. Richard Hauptmann was a German immigrant who became infamous for the kidnapping and elimination of the infant son of famed aviator Charles Lindbergh and his wife Anne Morrow Lindbergh. The case, popularly known as the Lindbergh kidnapping, captivated the nation during the early 1930s and resulted in one of the most high-profile trials in American history. On the evening of March 1, 1932, 20-month-old Charles Lindbergh Jr. was taken from his crib at the Lindbergh family home in New Jersey. A ransom note demanding $50,000 was left behind. Despite the payment of the ransom, the baby's body was found in a nearby wooded area 2 months later. The investigation into the crime led authorities to Richard Hauptmann, who was arrested on September 19, 1934. On September 26, 1934, Hauptmann was charged with extortion in the Supreme Court of Bronx County, New York. Shortly after, on October 8, 1934, he was also indicted for homicide in Hunterdon County, New Jersey. Just 2 days after the second indictment, the governor of New York honored the request of the governor of New Jersey for Hauptmann's surrender. Subsequently, on October 19, 1934, he was transferred to Hunterdon County Jail in Flemington, New Jersey, where he awaited his trial. Hauptmann's trial began on January 3, 1935, and it quickly became a media sensation. The evidence against him was largely circumstantial, but the prosecution argued that the ransom money was found in his possession, and handwriting experts testified that the ransom note matched his handwriting. Hauptmann maintained his innocence throughout the trial, claiming that he had received the money money from a friend and had no involvement in the kidnapping or homicide. The trial he faced lasted 5 weeks and earned him the moniker Trial of the Century, and he was widely referred to as the most hated man in the world. Hauptman's attorney, Edward J. Riley, contended that the evidence against Hauptman was purely circumstantial. There were no credible witnesses who had seen Hauptman at the crime scene, and his fingerprints were not discovered on the ladder, the ransom notes, or anywhere in the nursery. Despite these arguments, Hauptman was convicted and promptly handed the death penalty. Though he made appeals, his execution was postponed twice while New Jersey Governor Harold G. Haupman reevaluated the case. And despite his protests, Hauptman was found guilty of premeditated homicide and sentenced to death. He was executed in the electric chair on April 3, 1936, at the New Jersey State Jail. And as for what happens to kidnappers like Richard Hauptman in jail, their experiences will always depend on the nature of the prison and the severity of their crimes. In the 1930s, prison conditions were harsh, and death row inmates lived in challenging circumstances. Hauptman likely endured limited privileges, restricted social interaction, and constant supervision, but he also faced a highly publicized trial, intense media attention, and ultimately the death penalty. 5. Albert Fish. Albert Fish, also known as the Gray Man and the Werewolf of Wisteria, was an American serial offender and kidnapper who terrorized the nation during the 1920s and 1930s. His crimes, which included the abduction, torture, and elimination of children, were indeed heinous. Fish's criminal activities spanned several states, and he targeted young children, often from impoverished backgrounds. He would lure them away from their families with promises of money or treats before subjecting them to unspeakable horrors. His crimes were so gruesome and sadistic that he quickly gained notoriety as one of the most depraved and deranged criminals of his time. In 1934, Fish was arrested for the kidnapping and elimination of 10-year-old Grace Budd, whose disappearance had remained unsolved for years. The police traced a letter sent to Grace's family detailing the horrifying events leading to her death. During the investigation and subsequent trial, more details about his other crimes surfaced. Fish's trial was a shocking spectacle, and he showed no remorse for his actions. Instead, he reveled in describing the gruesome details of his crimes, causing deep anguish to the victims' families and horror to those present in the courtroom. Though there were reports to support that Fish might have been mentally disabled. Some of these reports which support the claims include their family history of mental illness, and in 1924, at the age of 54 and experiencing psychosis, Albert Fish believed that he was receiving divine instructions from God to torture and mutilate children. In 1935, he was found guilty of kidnapping and homicide and was sentenced to death in the electric chair. Fish was confined to death row in the notorious Sing Sing Correctional Facility in New York. He spent his final days in a state of isolation, closely monitored by guards to prevent any attempts at self-harm or harm to his fellow inmates. In contemporary times, kidnappers and serial killers who are sentenced to life in prison or the death penalty face rigorous security measures. To ensure their safety and the safety of others, they may be held in protective custody or solitary confinement, where their interactions with other inmates are limited. During his time in prison, Fish claimed to hear voices and experienced hallucinations, further cementing his reputation as a deeply disturbed individual. Despite his mental state, authorities deemed him fit for execution, and he was put to death on January 16, 1936. Fish is said to have assisted the executioner in placing the electric chair's electrodes on his body. His last words were apparently, "I don't even know why I'm here." After the execution, Fish's lawyer, James Dempsey, mentioned having possession of his client's final statement. It was several pages of handwritten notes that Fish supposedly wrote just before his death. When asked to reveal the contents of the document, Dempsey refused, stating that it contained extremely obscene and offensive language and that he had no intention of showing it to anyone. 6. Theodore Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy was an infamous American serial offender who terrorized the nation during the 1970s. He was responsible for the abduction, physical assault, and homicide of at least 30 young women across multiple states. Bundy's charming demeanor and intelligence allowed him to gain the trust of his victims before brutally attacking them, making him one of the most notorious and enigmatic criminals in history. In 1975, Bundy was arrested and charged with the kidnapping of Carol Duranch in Utah. His capture led to further investigations, and he was linked to several other disappearances. During his trial, Bundy shocked the public and confounded authorities by acting as his own attorney and displaying a manipulative and charismatic personality in the courtroom. Bundy was ultimately convicted and sentenced to death for multiple homicides. He spent years on death row, filing numerous appeals and engaging in manipulative tactics to delay his execution. Despite his attempts to avoid facing justice, Bundy was executed in the electric chair on January 24, 1989 at the Florida State Prison. Bundy's notoriety as a serial killer and the gruesome nature of his crimes made him a high-profile inmate, and his safety was a significant concern. To protect him from potential harm from other inmates, he was kept in isolation or under strict security measures. Life for inmates like Bundy in high-security facilities is characterized by constant supervision, limited privileges, and restricted social interaction. The prison authorities ensure that they are kept away from other prisoners to prevent violent incidents and maintain the safety of both the inmate and the prison population. Despite advice from friends and legal advisors to stay put, Bundy ignored it and attempted to escape jail in Glenwood Springs. The case against him was weakening, with favorable pretrial motions and crucial evidence ruled inadmissible. Had he stayed, he had a good chance of being acquitted and deterring other prosecutors from pursuing him. With only a year and a half left on the Durange conviction, he could have potentially regained his freedom. During his jail terms, Bundy managed to accumulate $500 in cash smuggled in by visitors over 6 months, with the help of one particular visitor named Boone. Apart from the attempted escape in Glenwood Springs, Bundy managed to escape from custody twice in 1977. He broke out of a Colorado jail by jumping out of a window, and later, while in court in Aspen, he jumped out of a second-story window and evaded capture for several days. At 7:16 a.m. EST on Tuesday, January 24, 1989, Bundy was executed in the Rayford electric chair. Just before his death, he addressed his attorney Jim Coleman and Methodist minister Fred Lawrence, saying, "Jim and Fred, I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." Meanwhile, outside the prison, hundreds of revelers sang, danced, and set off fireworks in a nearby pasture as the execution took place. They cheered as the white hearse carrying Bundy's body left the prison premises. 7. Gary Heidnick. Gary Heidnick was an American serial killer and kidnapper who committed gruesome crimes during the 1980s. He is infamous for abducting and torturing multiple young women in his Philadelphia home, which he referred to as his House of Horrors. His actions shocked the nation and earned him a place among the most depraved criminals in American history. Between November 1986 and March 1987, Heidnick kidnapped, took advantage of, and tortured 6 women. He kept them captive in a makeshift dungeon in the basement of his house, subjecting them to unimaginable horrors. He would often starve them, electrocute them, and even perform crude surgical procedures on them. In March 1987, one of the captives, Josefina Rivera, managed to escape and alerted the authorities to the horrifying situation in Heidnick's house. The police raided the premises and discovered the shocking truth. They rescued the remaining captives and arrested Heidnick. After being arrested in April 1987, Heidnick made an attempt to hang himself in his jail cell. During his trial, Heidnick's defense claimed that he was mentally ill and not fit to stand trial. However, he was found competent to stand trial, and in July 1988, he was convicted of 2 counts of premeditated homicide and sentenced to death. Heidnick's chilling crimes and bizarre and sadistic behavior during the trial drew significant media attention and public outcry. But what happened to Gary Heidnick in jail? Well, the experience will always depend on the type of prison he ended up in and the security measures being taken in such a prison. In Heidnick's case, he was sent to death row in Pennsylvania's State Correctional Institution at Pittsburgh, where he spent most of his time in isolation. Death row inmates are typically kept under strict security to prevent harm to themselves and others, and Heidnick, like other high-profile inmates, was closely monitored by prison authorities, and measures were taken to ensure his safety and prevent any violent incidents. However, in January 1989, despite being closely monitored and safety measures in place, Heidnick attempted suicide by overdosing on prescribed Thorazine. 8 years later, Heidnick's daughter, Maxine Davidson White, and his ex-wife, Betty Heidnick, filed a lawsuit in federal court requesting a stay of execution. They argued that Heidnick was not mentally competent enough to be executed. After 2 years of legal proceedings in different courts, on July 3, 1999, the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania made its final ruling, allowing Heidnick's execution to proceed. Before his execution, Heidnick's last meal consisted of 2 slices of cheese pizza and black coffee. He was executed by lethal injection on July 6, 1999, at the State Correctional Institution, Rockview in Bellefonte, Pennsylvania, and his body was cremated. As of 2022, he was the last person to have been executed by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. He remains one of only 3 people executed in Pennsylvania since the resumption of the death penalty. 8. Angelo Lamarca. Peter Weinberger, a 1-month-old infant, was kidnapped on July 4, 1956 in New York State. Despite being from a suburban middle-class family, not a wealthy and prominent one, the case drew significant attention. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, was required by law to wait 7 days before getting involved in the investigation. The extensive investigation lasting 6 weeks led to the arrest of Angelo John Lamarca, a 31-year-old man. Lamarca confessed to kidnapping and abandoning Peter Weinberger due to his financial difficulties. Tragically, Peter was found lifeless from asphyxia, with starvation and exposure as contributing factors. During Lamarca's highly publicized trial, he tried to attribute the crime to temporary insanity caused by financial stress. However, he was convicted of first-degree homicide and kidnapping and sentenced to death. After spending over 18 months on death row, Lamarca was executed in Sing Sing Prison's electric chair in 1958. Following the case, then-President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed legislation to reduce the FBI's waiting period in kidnapping cases from 7 days to 24 hours. Lamarca's background revealed a history of bootlegging and financial troubles. He kidnapped Peter Weinberger when the baby was left unattended in a carriage on the patio. The investigation involved multiple ransom notes and a staged news conference to attract the kidnapper. Lamarca was eventually traced and found guilty, and his defense tried to claim temporary insanity due to mounting debts. In those times, a premeditated homicide conviction in New York carried an automatic death sentence. However, because Lamarca was convicted of felony first-degree homicide rather than premeditated first-degree homicide, the jury had the option of recommending mercy and sparing his life. Lamarca's defense lawyers appealed to the jury to consider his young children and let him live. The prosecution countered, asking what mercy was shown to baby Peter when he was left in that woods. Despite the plea, Lamarca's jury chose not to recommend mercy, resulting in a death sentence. Hearing the verdict, Lamarca's wife and mother, who were present in the courtroom, reportedly fainted. A week after, on December 14, 1956, Lamarca was officially sentenced to death, with Nassau County Judge Mario Pittoni scheduling his execution for the week of January 28, 1957. However, his execution was postponed due to appeals, but ultimately, he was executed on August 7, 1958. The day before his execution, Angelo Lamarca was given the opportunity to spend his final day with his wife, Donna, and other family members. Donna Lamarca, aged 33, arrived at the prison death house at 10 a.m. Angelo had been moved from his cell to the pre-execution cell, which was just 30 feet away from the electric chair. However, he was brought to a reception room to spend the morning with his wife and relatives. The Peter Weinberger kidnapping case led to changes in kidnapping investigation procedures, with the Federal Kidnapping Act amended to allow the FBI to intervene after just 24 hours. 9. David Parker Ray. David Parker Ray, also known as the Toy Box Killer, was a notorious kidnapper and serial killer who terrorized the residents of Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, and its surrounding areas during the 1990s. His case shed light on the horrific nature of his crimes and the consequences that awaited him in jail. Ray's reign of terror began in the mid-1990s when he, along with his accomplices, kidnapped and tortured numerous women in a specially designed torture chamber he called the Toy Box. The chamber was equipped with various tools and instruments used to inflict unimaginable pain and suffering on his victims. Ray would subject these women to sadistic acts, including physical assault and severe physical abuse. In 1999, Ray's crimes came to light when one of his intended victims, Cynthia Vigil, managed to escape from his clutches. Vigil provided crucial information to the authorities, leading to Ray's arrest. The police also discovered evidence of Ray's heinous acts on his property, which confirmed the horrifying extent of his crimes. Following his arrest, David Parker Ray was charged with multiple counts of kidnapping, physical assault, and torture. His trial was highly publicized and captured the attention of the nation as the details of his sadistic crimes were revealed. He was found guilty on multiple charges by the jury and was sentenced to over 224 years in prison. The exact number of murder victims Ray claimed over the years remains uncertain. Ray maintained a detailed diary of his actions towards each victim, but he did not reveal the burial locations of any of them. But following his arrest, Ray consented to cooperate with the authorities and reveal the burial locations of his victims. Despite his conviction and lengthy sentence, David Parker Ray never faced the full extent of his punishment. In May 2002, while preparing for interrogation, he suffered a heart attack and passed away at the age of 62. His death meant that he escaped the justice that many of his victims and their families sought. For them, his demise brought mixed emotions of relief that he could no longer harm anyone else, but also a sense of frustration that he did not live to serve his full sentence. However, the consequences of David Parker Ray's actions did not end with his death. The surviving victims and their families continued to cope with the physical and psychological trauma caused by his sadistic acts. They had to live with the lifelong scars of the unimaginable pain they endured at his hands. In the aftermath of Ray's arrest and death, the burial sites of his victims remain undisclosed. His accomplice, Cindy Hendy, was unable to provide any assistance to the investigators in locating any potential bodies. Eventually, Hendy was sentenced to 36 years in prison for her involvement in the crimes and was released on July 15, 2019, having served the full 2-year parole term behind bars. 10. William Edward Hickman. William Edward Hickman was a notorious kidnapper in the early 20th century. His case stands as a chilling example of the extreme actions taken by some criminals and the subsequent legal proceedings that followed. When discussing what happens to kidnappers in jail, Hickman's story offers insight into the justice system of that era. Born in 1908 in Kansas, Hickman's life turned dark when, at just 19 years old, he committed a shocking crime that would send chills down your spine. His crime was all about the tragic case of Frances Marion Parker, an American child who was abducted and fatally dealt with in Los Angeles, California in 1927. Parker went missing on December 15, 1927, after an unknown man posing as her father's employee checked her out of school with a false claim that her father had been in an accident. The next day, the Parker family received ransom letters demanding $1,500 in gold for her safe return. Despite complying with the demands, her father met the kidnapper for the exchange, only to have Marion's mutilated body thrown out of the car as the assailant fled. The child had been brutally dismembered. The abduction and elimination of Marion Parker led to a massive manhunt, and the criminal was soon identified as William Edward Hickman, a former co-worker of Marion's father. He was arrested and quickly confessed to the heinous crime, claiming a supernatural deity named Providence had directed him to commit it. During the trial, Hickman's defense team asserted that he was mentally unstable, claiming that his religious grandfather and childhood traumas had influenced his actions. However, the jury did not accept the insanity defense, leading to a grim outcome. In February 1928, William Edward Hickman received a death sentence by hanging for his heinous crime. Despite the gravity of his offense, his legal battle did not conclude there. His lawyers filed several appeals, contesting the verdict and the legality of the death penalty, but the California Supreme Court upheld the sentence. In the final months leading up to his execution, there were reports that Hickman embraced Roman Catholicism and expressed remorse by writing letters of apology to the families of his victims. On October 19, 1928, the day of his execution, he was hanged at San Quentin State Prison. It is evident that the legal process in the early 20th century did not tolerate such heinous crimes. The severity of his actions led to a death sentence, which was eventually executed, showing that society deemed such crimes intolerable and deserving of the harshest punishment. The horrifying case of Frances Marion Parker's abduction and aftermath led to changes in the California legal system, as Hickman was one of the first defendants to use the state's new law, allowing pleas of not guilty by reason of insanity. However, the jury's rejection of this defense showed that severe crimes like kidnapping and homicide would not be excused lightly, even if the perpetrator claimed insanity. Well, all interesting videos must come to an end, but there's more where that came from. Just click on one of the cards on the screen to enjoy more videos.